with that, but we want to make sure we maintain the food service while enjoying the great program that we're going to have. My name is Benigna. Again, on behalf of the entire team of Moderator, we're glad you joined us. I'm going to invite you to notice that on your tables we have a great brochure. The World Affairs Council is focused on bringing global education to our community, and this is one of the ways that we do that. We host programs like this throughout the community on the west, southwest, and north side of town, as well as central Houston, all focused on global education. Today, we're so thrilled to have many panelists as well as our public speaker today. We have Benigna Cortés Leiss, who's a non-resident fellow in Latin America at the Baker Institute. As well, we have Matlock, who's a partner of Mayor Brown and co-leader of energy transition. We have Gustavo Tardin, Barbosa, who's the CEO of Petrobras Americas. And our moderator for our conversation is Nadorff. He is Counsel Mayor Brown LLP. So I'm going to invite you all to continue having your wonderful food service. I'm going to ask you to draw your attention here to the speaker. And if you would like more food service, just flip over your card. You don't have to get the attention of everybody that will be looking for that. So it's our honor today for me to introduce Dr. Francisco Monaldi, who is a fellow in Latin American Energy Policy and the director of Latin American Energy Program at the Center for Energy Studies at Leiss University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. He's also a fellow at the Center for the U.S. and Mexico and lecturer in energy economics, in addition to being the founding director and professor at the Center for Energy and Environment in IESA Venezuela. As well, he's also involved with the Technology Center Monterey. I think we're getting a little bit of feedback. I don't know if our program colleagues can help with that. And he is also a fellow at Columbia University. He's taught at Harvard University, Development Center, Tufts, Stanford, and Cuba Institute. Please give a warm welcome to Francisco Monaldi.
Thank you very much, Marianne. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I hope I can get your attention while you have enjoyed this Brazilian churrascaria, which is of course very appropriate for what we're going to be talking about today, which is sort of the future of Brazil, Brazil's energy industry in the midst of the energy transition that is, of course, ongoing. So to first give you a little bit of sort of the broader perspective, historical perspective, let me just say that Brazil is clearly the success story of energy policy in Latin America. I mean, think about this. Brazil produced 600,000 barrels per day in 1990 when I was a college student, and nobody expected Brazil to become a powerhouse in oil at the time. It was a significant energy importer, and it had developed this very interesting program of biofuels. By 2000, it was producing more than 1 million barrels. By 2010, more than 2 million barrels, and today it's producing more than 3 million barrels of oil per day, surpassing Kuwait and the United Arab Emirates. So Brazil is now a powerhouse, comparable to the OPEC, the leading OPEC producers. It's of course the largest producer in Latin America. That of course contrasts with the collapse in production in Venezuela and the significant decline in Mexico. And the government of Brazil forecasts a continued increase to surpassing 5 million barrels of oil sometime after 2030. I think that's an ambitious goal, but one that might be within reach at some point. So the country is clearly having a significant increase in oil production. The success of Brazil can be attributed to a long-term energy policy, an strong institutional framework with the ANP, the Petrobras, which is a company listed, the respect for property rights compared to other countries in the region, and the significant capacities that Petrobras has developed in offshore. And of course, a healthy dose of geological luck, because without some significant luck, this was not have been possible. And you can see that by what, for example, Colombia, a country that has done most of the same things as Brazil, but of course has not found oil in any significant way. But since we're going to talk about the future in the energy transition, let me mention a little bit of some facts about what we're seeing in terms of the energy transition. There is no doubt that the energy transition is happening, but there are tremendous uncertainty about the pace and the timing of the transition. So to give you an idea, there are projections from very respected consultancies that still see some growth in the demand for oil, but a very modest growth rate to say about 108 million barrels of oil per day. Today we have about 100, a little bit less of demand. I mean 108 in 2050. But if you look at what would be necessary to keep the increase in temperatures by 1 degree, as the international community is trying to reach, then you have a massive collapse in the demand of oil by 2050, as much as 75% decline, or up to 25 million barrels. In between, this is of course a normative scenario that is based on what would be required according to the International Energy Agency, and it's very unlikely to be achieved, unfortunately, because of course that's a very important goal. But in between, you have scenarios of significant decline that are less dramatic, and in which there is still a lot of space for Brazil to increase production for the next couple of decades. Lower demand will inevitably mean lower oil rents, lower prices, and therefore this will be a less profitable business, particularly for producers that have higher cost, high carbon intensity in oil production. In the short and medium term, as you probably know, the price of oil is actually at its highest levels in 2014. So we are witnessing what could be considered, at least for now, a mini cycle of high prices. And I think we can expect a lot of volatility in the next few years because of all these massive uncertainties that we are talking about, and all the uncertainty about policy. In any case, it seems in the most plausible scenarios that we will need very significant oil investment in order to compensate for the decline of existing fields in production. Latin America will clearly be affected by the energy transition, and some countries in clearly a negative way, in the sense that the major oil producers in the region concentrate the second largest reserves outside of the Middle East, and many of those reserves are not going to be able to be produced, are going to be in a way stranded. Of course, this is concentrated on the oil-dependent countries of the region. Venezuela, Ecuador, and Colombia, for example, are oil-dependent countries. Guyana is going to become the largest oil producer per capita on Earth, and at the very moment in which the energy transition is happening. So these countries clearly have faced a tremendous challenge because of their oil dependence. Countries that are more dependent on gas, like Bolivia and Trinidad and other gas producers, of course, gas will have a sort of a longer shelf life, but they still have some significant challenges. And again, this will depend a lot on the carbon intensity of these producers, their cost, the capacity to keep costs down, to be efficient, the nature of the investment. If it's a short cycle investment, meaning that you can recover, like in shale, very quickly your investment, or a very long-term kind of project, the fact that, if it's offshore, onshore, and the ESG issues that those projects might face. There are going to be some winners in the region, some net winners. For example, Chile is a country that is a tremendous producer of critical minerals for the energy transition. It has tremendous advantages in terms of solar and wind, and is currently a net importer of hydrocarbons with a lot of difficulty importing those hydrocarbons. So for Chile, this points in a very positive way. I would say Brazil is in the middle because it's a country that has a lot of potential to continue being an oil producer, but without a doubt, the oil industry having the sun in its back represents a challenge. Also, one difficult problem for Latin America is that the energy transition requires a lot of investments, and this is a region that is facing a lot of political instability. That after COVID, we had some bad years in terms of the economy since 2014 or even earlier in some cases, and last year was, of course, a disaster. So for countries to tell their populations to assume costs today for something that benefits the world in the long term, it's going to be hard, politically hard. And the region, unfortunately, is in a bad shape in terms of cooperation between countries. There is no leadership in the region in terms of cooperation. So I think that is concerning. Brazil, of course, because it has this massive resource base in offshore, will be, as I said, in a way affected. But on the other hand, it's better positioned than most other countries to take advantage of the window of opportunity that remains. First of all, because the pre-salts have reached very high productivity levels in their wells are on the most productive in the region, and they can withstand probably lower prices. They, the figure of $35 per barrel as a sort of break-even appears to be very competitive. And it's also not extra heavy. Also, it's less carbon intensive than other competitors like Venezuela or Canada. However, think about this. The very large sunk investments that are required to develop a deep water project and the long maturity of this project at some point will represent a very significant risk for an investor to take. And so there is a risk that at some point some of these assets will become stranded. Contrast this with short cycle projects. Even in countries that have very high above-ground risk, like Argentina or Venezuela, it's much faster, that you can recoup your investment in these onshore short-cycle projects. The projects already developed in Brazil, there is no doubt that they are going to be continued and they are going to be super profitable. I think even in the bad scenarios in terms of profitability. But as I said, at some point, I think there is a risk that. And by the way, even today we have seen that even though Brazil continues to increase production, and when we see all this enthusiasm about Brazil, the last bidding rounds have not been very successful. And if you see the number of oil rigs in operation in Brazil, you see that it's in a very low level compared to past episodes. So in a way, Brazil is living off its past sort of success, but it needs to do more to become to remain competitive. Petrobras, it seems to be one of the best positioned national companies in the region to adapt to the energy transition. It has set an ambitious goal. It has been restructuring. It has divested from non-strategic assets, and it has, as I said, an ambitious agenda. Only Ecopetrol in the region seems to be in a sort of moving in the same direction, and contrast this with Pemex or with, of course, the PDVSA or Petroecuador or YPF. Brazil also recently has announced some significant commitments in terms of limiting deforestation and cutting carbon emissions. that I think are very important for the international community to really, to allow Brazil to continue developing its energy sector with the international community accepting the role of Brazil and taking advantage with a regulated carbon market of green energy initiative. Still, in Brazil today, we see from time to time the risk of government intervention. We saw the removal of the head of CEO of Petrobras recently. We see the pressure now for Petrobras to again subsidize, or the country of Brazil to subsidize the domestic market of transport fuels. And those pressures might continue to intensify as the price of oil goes up, or there is an evaluation, and that means an inflation in transport fuels, and also that's a politically hot potato for this government or for any other government. You can see it here in the U.S. With the Biden administration. And this, by the way, this political interference could also derail some of the investment from refineries, because are you going to invest in a refinery in a country that has this political interference in setting the price? That could be moreover. If former President Lula comes back into power, there might be some additional political interference. One hope that Mr. Lula has learned about the past mistakes of the policies and the scandals that happened around Petrobras. But there is a clear tendency on the left in Brazil, on the PT, on getting on making the oil industry more focused on development goals rather than just in commercial goals and profitability. For example, getting them to local content policies, making the national company invest in refineries that are not needed. This is not going to be as extreme ever as López Obrador in Mexico, I think, but there is a chance of more political interference during a Lula administration. Finally, if President Bolsonaro instead is re-elected, there is, he has mentioned a few times, not in a very consistent way, the possibility of privatizing Petrobras. This would be a very controversial policy, but it could be, a very interesting, if they are able to privatize Petrobras now, maybe after a re-election of Bolsonaro, this could be a topic in the agenda. And and I think if it's done well, it will be a good policy. However, it could be controversial and it could not work. So with that, I thank you for the invitation, and I give my friend Ronan to provide the time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francisco. My name is Ronan Monaldi. I'm the Director of Programs for the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston. It's wonderful to see a full and over-capacity room. Thank you all for your patience. It's wonderful to see the great response we've had. And again, I wanted to thank Yvonne and Norman and Jose and everyone, and Mayor Brown. They've always been wonderful partners and wonderful supporters of the council. And Francisco, a longtime incredible friend of the council, and everyone at Bakers too. It's great to see you all again. And please enjoy your lunch. We're going to start the panel discussion here shortly. And I'm just delighted to introduce the moderator this afternoon. Norman Nadorff is the counsel to Mayor Brown and adjunct professor of law at the University of Houston Law Center. Please join me in welcoming Norman Nadorff. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I hope you've enjoyed your meal. Welcome to Michelle. Welcome to this event of the World Council of World Affairs Council of Houston and Mayor Brown. We're glad to have all of you with us today. Basically, what we're going to be, what I'd like to do now is just go ahead and introduce the panel, if I could, right? Gustavo? Normally, I would just be sitting among the panelists, so we'll just be part of the conversation. But we're a little short of space here today, so I thought it would work out better this way. And normally I would give some comments to sort of kind of set the tone for the panel discussion, but the professor did such a great job in terms of setting the stage for the discussion. I think that we can dispense with that. So what I'd like to do without further delay is go ahead and introduce our panel, because we are a bit short of time today, so I want to make sure that we spend as much time. And the introductions could be a lot longer, but I wanted to save the time for our discussion. So first we have, closest to me, Benigna Leiss. She is a non-resident fellow in Latin American Energy at Rice University Baker Institute and a former general director of Chevron Energía de Mexico. Previously, she was vice president Texaco Global Gas and Power Brazil. She has held multiple assignments in Latin America and West Africa. She started her career in the U.S. working for natural gas pipeline companies, supplying the Northeast and the Midwest. She has an undergraduate degree from Universidad de Chile and has an MSc from Surrey University, UK. Next we have Gustavo Tardin Barbosa. He has been CEO of Petrobras America since 2019. Gustavo joined Petrobras Group 35 years ago, where he held various managerial positions, including Treasurer of Global Head of Financial Planning and Risk Management, Controller of Petrobras International, and CFO of Petrobras America in Houston and Petrobras UK in London. His responsibilities as CEO of Petrobras America have included the divestment of Petrobras exploration and production assets in the Gulf of Mexico and its U.S. refinery assets. Then finally, we have Greg Matlock, who is a partner in Mayor Brown in the Houston office and a member of the Tax Transactions and Consulting Practice. He serves as global co-leader of the Tax Energy Group, and he also leads Mayor Brown's tax efforts regarding the energy transition for traditional natural resources based on businesses, including carbon capture use and sequestration and Section 45Q, waste to energy, hydrogen, biomass, and biofuels, and certain other energy efficient sources. So welcome to our panel. It was a short introduction, but in the interest of time, wanted to get to the actual discussion. So I think what I'd like to do to start off is to have maybe each of you individually define for me or for us what is energy transition in your opinion, and how has that affected your organization and your professional work? Shall I start with Benigna? Yes.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. This is a great opportunity to be here with all of you. I'm very happy to see that we are all anxious to be in person now, participating in this type of events. So it's very encouraging to see that we are willing to join us in a luncheon like this one. So, addressing the question here, what is energy transition? My perspective is that energy transition is a process and an evolution. Historically, you may remember that from history classes that during the Industrial Revolution was when burning wood was replaced with coal. And then right after, only that was in the 1700s, and then in the literally about 100 years ago, before the First World War, actually coal was replaced with oil for shipping. And coal has not disappeared since then, despite the fact that oil has been used all these years and increased its participation in the markets. So now, considering that we have all these new sources of energy and the solar panels and the wind turbines have become economically viable, it's just appropriate that they become part of the energy mix. So it's an evolution from my perspective rather than exchange, because changes of this type cannot happen from one day to the next one. And we can see that each country has a different profile or a different situation, a different approach to move into this new environment. So that would be my approach to, or my answer to your question.
Thank you very much, Benigna. And word for wise, these microphones work much better if you keep your mouth close to the microphone. They're not particularly dynamic.
Okay, thank you very much, every one of you, for the invitation. Pleasure for us to be here. What we're thinking about transition as a kind of a journey. Imagine that we are all in a plane. The whole population of the world is in a plane. And we will be landing this plane in the airport called Net Zero in 2050. So let's look at this journey until 2050. What exactly do we need? First, it's clear. If we're going to land, we have to reduce carbon. We have to go down. And we have to go down on targets. Short-term targets and things like that. Another point of this journey, we all need energy, more and more, lot more than we have today. And there's another one question for us that's clear, gotta be fair. When I think about fair, gotta be cost related, gotta be cheap. We cannot afford to pay more and more for energy. So basically, these are all the challenges that this plane will be facing. On the short run, this plane has turbulences, short-term turbulences. Number of countries perhaps with different views and interest. Although it looks like from Glasgow that we are having good news out of that. I mean, it looks like people is aligning themselves. I mean, we are all on the plane, so fair to think about it. Another interesting point here is regarding investments. If we look back to 2007, 2008, the energy sector was around 13-14% of the S&P 500. 13-14. It's now 2%, just 2%. Very deep reduction. But what exactly that means? It means that there is not a lot of investments. It's hard, as Dr. Francisco mentioned, to finance a huge project for the next 30 years. Now let's look at the demand. There's a very interesting number that I was looking at about this cryptocurrency world and ecosystem. Do you know that they are consuming now just the cryptocurrency ecosystem more than Argentina? And they will be catching up to Norway very soon. So look at the demand for energy. And then, looks like we are back to consume 100 million barrels of oil a day again. Numbers previous to the pandemic. Okay, with low investments and high demand, what's going to happen with prices? We're seeing that today. We're seeing that in Brazil. We're seeing that here. And prices means potential inflation. We're seeing that as well. So, let's start talking about Petrobras on all of that. So, although we have these turbulences, the plane must land. Petrobras firmly believes on Paris Agreement deals, and we think it's going to be a success. Paris Agreement deals. But even in the Paris Agreement schedules, even the most aggressive ones, be it on the 1.5 degrees or the 2 degrees, you're going to see oil there. Oil there for decades to come. Usually it's the oil that's harder to decarbonize. But it's not going to be the kind of oil that we know today, not the oil itself. But it's going to be a lot more efficient oil. What do I mean by efficient oil? A lot less carbon involved in the process of producing this oil. A lot less carbon. And more, as we need cheap oil, we must have cheap oil. So what we'll be looking at is more efficient, less carbon oil, plus very cheap crude. Our view in Petrobras, again, completely aligned with the metrics of the Paris Agreement, is that we are going to produce some of this crude. We know the crude will be phasing out, but we want to produce that crude, the cheap one and the less carbon one. How can we do that? So what we are doing is that we are getting all the numbers from the Paris Agreement and the targets and so on, and bringing into our planning system, to our strategic system, to our economics. I'll be talking about that later on, but I'm explaining a little bit in more details what we plan on that.
Great. Before I pass the microphone to Greg, I just want to say one thing that I found interesting about transition is whereas most of us maybe 5 years ago in my profession doing what I do would have called ourselves oil and gas lawyers, I find we're all calling ourselves energy lawyers, which is very significant in terms of the transition. But Greg, so tell me, as a lawyer, commercial lawyer working in this sector, what is your vision of or your definition of transition, and how's it affecting your work in the last 5 years or so?
Perfect, thank you. All right, am I on?
Yes.
Yes? You can hear me? No. No? Kind of? All right, we're going to try this. That's got to be better. Yes. All right. They put the tax guy at the end. Right? So my main role here is clearly entertainment value, because that's what tax lawyers are. But I appreciate you coming. It's a great turnout. So what we're seeing... Oh, I got to be like on it. All right, there we go.
Like a rock singer.
So, what we're seeing right now, so you asked about kind of the evolution of practice in energy transition. So I spend most all of my time on tax and economics. It's how to make these things work, how do we get shareholder returns, the cost point that you just raised. And so what you've seen, especially over the past couple of years, and what we're seeing as advisors, is a culmination of three factors. It's customer and consumer preferences. Now there's an elasticity to that, right? You will pay for something good, but only to a point. More importantly, you're seeing capital preferences, which is to the investment piece. Most of our clients, well, a lot of clients, generally, especially traditional oil and gas, they're trying to find capital and it's not there. But if you can add a green aspect to it, you may be able to get capital. Right? So whether or not you want to do this or not, that's where the capital is pushing. And then the third factor is government incentives. And so if you look at a bunch of activities globally, carbon capture would be an example. Carbon capture is not new. Carbon capture has utterly failed in other parts of the world. Because although you had customer preference, you had capital preference, you didn't have government incentive, and therefore the project wasn't economical. So it's the culmination, at least in certain parts of the world, where you're seeing customers wanting things, more importantly, capital wanting something, and tying that with governments who are providing incentives. And so what we're seeing is a significant uptick in investment interest. Everybody's calling themselves an energy lawyer, not an oil and gas lawyer, which is fine. The other piece that we're seeing is, at least from my perspective, and what gets missed, this is definitely an and not an or. Talked a little bit about the demand side and the growth, and this is going to differ by country, by sector. It's not an outright abandonment into wind and solar. It can't be. Right? The growth is just too big on the demand side. And so it's how do we operate on traditional hydrocarbons in a cleaner, more effective manner. We're in other parts of the sector, how do we invest in greener, more alternative forms of energy. But it's not a one or another. This is not a closed system of options. What fascinates me, and you see this on a lot of articles, they say, well, renewable energy just is going to occupy a greater piece of the pie. That may be true. Marginal dollars may flow into renewable energy. That may be true, right? It's a forecast, and we all know that they're all wrong no matter what they do. But what gets missed is they show a pie right next to a pie of equal size, and that's just not the case. Marginal dollars to go into renewable energy, the pie is going to grow exponentially. So is the demand for oil going to go down long term? I haven't seen a projection that says that over the next 10, 15, 20 years. Coal in an underdeveloped country, they still do that. And so it's there's a narrative around it, but it's definitely an and not an or. And I could talk for hours on tax, which I know each and every one of you want to hear. But I will stop there.
So, Benigna, a lot of people refer to natural gas as being the transitional fuel, and you have a lot of experience in Mexico, Chile, Brazil. So, how do you make a comparison between the kinds of projects that are happening in the rest of Latin America and Brazil, and how they're doing comparatively between themselves?
Thank you for that question. Are you hearing me now or not?
Yes.
Okay. These three countries, I'm going to make a comparison here between these three countries for the approaches they have had between Chile and Mexico and Brazil. As you can imagine, and as you know, these are very different countries with very, very different profiles and situations. Chile is the smallest of the three of them, and the carbon emissions that Chile produces currently is less than 0.5%. It's 0.3% of the worldwide carbon emissions are being produced by Chile. However, because Chile is, as Francisco mentioned, is 100% dependent on imports of hydrocarbons, of coal, oil, and natural gas and LNG, has actually discovered what we would have thought is the obvious, is that Chile is a very long country, that in the northern part it has the best solar radiation and the best conditions for having solar panels, solar power. In the extreme south, which is in the Patagonia, it has the best winds onshore. Therefore, wind power is a great alternative. As a result of that, the government actually has designed a strategy to move forward with achieving zero emissions by 2050, considering this advantage that Chile has. And as a result of that, one of the big newcomers, which is very old by the way, is hydrogen. Hydrogen has been around for a long, long time as a concept, but now, considering that the major component of the cost of hydrogen is the power, the electricity required to make these electrolyzers function, actually with green power, meaning solar or wind power, it can actually make hydrogen economically viable. So as a result of that, Chile has moved forward with this strategy to become not only a producer of hydrogen, but also a potential exporter over the years. And the big advantage that I will compare that with Brazil as well, is the fact that Chile has the ports, of course, because it's such a narrow country with plenty of ports, and because it has been importing LNG, has actually the ports with the facilities for big ships. Therefore, they feel that they can actually export hydrogen once they are ready for it. And projects in partnership with Siemens and with French companies are actually ongoing right now. One in the south, a major project, as well as one in the north, to produce ammonia first to actually get it to become hydrogen. So natural gas was critical in this evolution that I mentioned at the beginning of my definition of energy transition, because you have the infrastructure. You build the infrastructure to have receive LNG ships in the country. So it looks like Chile is on the go to actually get to net zero by 2050. Going to Mexico is a very different situation. Mexico still has more than 80% of the primary energy are fossil fuels. And they have, however, they have reduced their emissions in the last 10 years from 1.5% to 1.3% of the worldwide carbon emissions. And that has been the result of natural gas, because actually the electricity in Mexico had the advantage of building combined cycle plants that actually have been using natural gas, and not only the domestic natural gas, but also the imported natural gas from the US and actually even from Peru. There was a time that, because they have LNG receiving terminals. Unfortunately, that situation is at this point is not clear, the future of the ability for Mexico to continue moving into the energy transition, because they have this electric reform that is on the table right now under discussion, and the last I have heard is that it will be in Congress for discussion next April to see whether they approve it or not, where they will go back to CFE, the National Electric Company, to become the major provider of electricity. And what they have are the old fuel oil plants and the hydro power plants, which are in conditions that they really need plenty of investment to be able to produce the electricity that the country needs. Renewables, solar and wind, have been growing significantly. However, the current government is not very eager to support those plans. So that, as I said, is very questionable how the situation will evolve in the near future and in the, we don't know, the long term, obviously. Moving to Brazil, actually that is a very positive picture, because Brazil has already more than 45% of their primary energy is already renewable. And that is the result of two wonderful situations, I would call it. Number one is that they had the famous Iguazu Falls. Therefore, they have relied on hydropower for a long time and for a significant portion of their electricity needs. And they did something that is quite unusual, I would say, for Latin America, is that they started having the biofuels development, that actually the ethanol became, it was forced, you had an obligation to actually use ethanol in your gasoline. Therefore, the biofuels is the most successful industry in the region. In Latin America, it's right after the US that has also significant biofuels production. However, because Brazil again has the big advantage of having plenty of sun and plenty of wind in the northern part, in the state of Ceará, there are these projects now of actually using the solar energy and the wind energy for hydrogen as well. So Brazil has a major project, announced a major project with an Australian company to actually produce hydrogen as well. So I can see that Chile, with less than 20 million people, and Brazil with more than 200 million people, are going to be competing potentially in the future on the hydrogen markets. So that is a very interesting development from my perspective. So, however, in this big picture, we cannot forget the impact that Francisco was mentioning as well, is the politics. We don't know if the government in Brazil and the government in Chile, Chile has elections now in this month, actually, on the 21st, for the presidential elections, that the new government will take office next March. We don't know whether they will be continue to support these efforts or not. And in Brazil, as Francisco mentioned, we don't know either what is going to be the position of the next government. So that's what I can say, and how gas has had an impact in these countries.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to keep pumping out questions. At the same time, if either of you would like to comment on what's been said, a dialogue is always nicer than just coming from the moderators.
Well, let's see. Perfect. I think, let's see. I think it's good news to have Brazil and Chile competing for hydrogen. This is great news. Regarding the next president, remember the plane will be landing in 2050, so we're going to have 8 presidents in front of us both. So we hope that good terms and good minds prevail. Let me go back a little bit for our plans in Petrobras that I was telling you that we want to be producing the efficient oil and the low-cost oil. The low cost, I mean $35 per barrel. We are preparing ourselves to produce efficient oil at $35 per barrel. Don't know how many of you know, but Petrobras is sitting on a big province of oil called the pre-salt. Before that, we were trying to find oil in 27 countries, including here in the US. We found some as well. But then we found this huge province on our backyard, around 300 kilometers offshore Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo. And the good news of that is that it's very economical and very well located geographically speaking. Because as you know, around 40-45% of the GDP of the country is located exactly in that area. It's very economical. But it doesn't matter to be only economic. We have to be the efficient oil I was telling you about regarding landing our plane carbon related. So what we have is targets, 2-year targets. We've been doing that since 2010. And from 2010 to today, we were able to reduce total absolute emissions of Petrobras in 29%. The methane emission of Petrobras also has been reduced 50%. It's basically flaring. We have to flare a lot of gas when we don't have a pipeline. So the reduction there was good, and it's good to know that the whole world is very much concerned about ethane because it's a kind of a low-hanging fruit. I mean, we can really do that in a short term, and so our plane will be closer to the airport. And regarding carbon efficiency, in the past 10 years, we've been able to reduce it 47%. So the metrics now, looking forward, we don't have metrics up to 2050. And the reason is simple. The duration of an oil field, we're talking about 20 years, 15 years, something like that. So we have metrics for 5 years, we have metrics for 10 years. So our metrics is a next 25 reduction on absolute operating emissions for 2030, 0 routine flaring, that's the one related to the methane gas, by 2030, and 40 million tons of CO2 re-injection. If I have to pick one technology that is changing the way we are dealing with carbon is clearly the CCUS, the carbon capture, usage, and storage. And this is it's a big deal. It's technology. 20% of this technology is being used by Petrobras. The whole world, 20% is being used by us on the pre-salt in order to bring down the carbon. For all of that, we will be investing $170 million in the next 6 years. $1 billion in 6 years. A lot of R&D as well for the carbon capture, and a lot of R&D for wind and solar. And this is another interesting point here that we have kind of differences in the world. In the US, usually the companies, the investor community will tell the companies, do what you know how to do best. Let the investor choose where they want to invest, but keep doing what you know how to do best. So companies are focusing a lot more on their business, if it's on oil and gas, and trying to reduce carbon. While in Europe, they have a little bit different views. They're moving towards also producing renewables. So this is a kind of a different view. Petrobras is more towards the US view, but in the next years we will also have R&D investments on wind and solar. Brazil naturally is very well positioned for wind and solar, like Benigna mentioned. And then we have a whole bunch of offshore facilities that could be the supporting for all the offshore wind.
Thank you so much. You guys are an ideal panel because I don't have to do much moderating here. The questions just flowing. So basically, Greg, you mentioned before about government incentives and how important that is. Could you just tell us a little bit about, is this going to be driven by government incentives, by consumers, by companies, by NGOs? I mean, but getting back to incentives, what's the role there? How important is that?
Sure.
Hosting things. We have about 5 minutes before we need to get into the Q&A.
Well, you let me out of my cage and gave me a microphone, so anything can happen. I think both of you spoke about different aspects that show the importance of government incentives. Hydrogen, for example, where you're in a geography where the government isn't supporting it and you're not seeing it move forward. So hydrogen, 16 countries have economic incentives. Globally, when we talk to our peers, hydrogen is the early mover on a global basis as opposed to carbon capture, putting aside the great work Petrobras has done. And that's not by accident, right? That's because there's capital preferences, consumer preferences, but also incentives. You incentivize an activity, you make it either more economical or the inverse, right? Because taxes and incentives can do two things. They can either encourage investment or they can discourage activity. And so you have to match those up with what the desired goals are. But if you make a project economical, the dollars flow there, the interest flows there. It's just natural. We haven't seen that yet, like say in the US. Brazil's been a great story on all fronts, just period. But like in the US, we haven't seen it in hydrogen because it's not incentivized. You're starting to see movement with some of the recent legislation to incentivize hydrogen. We haven't seen that movement. The inverse is on carbon capture. Carbon capture was not successful in Europe. Carbon capture use and sequestration is starting to be wildly successful, or I expect it to be in the US. And that's because there's a significant government incentive behind it. So matching those two is going to be very, very important.
Well, we're down to about the 10-minute period in terms of our allotted time for today's event, although we can actually stay longer if people want. I think I will go to question and answer now. And if you like, you can say who you are, who you're with, or not do so, and you can address your questions to a particular panelist or just generally. And if you'd like to address a question to the professor as well, I'm sure he'd be glad to answer questions. So, any questions at this point from anybody in the room? Yes, please.
Well, my name is Alan Livingston. I'm in the oil industry. But this is going to be the next decade. I'm not going to see much of it, but anyway, the next decade is going to be a great competition, not only between technologies, but also between capital. And a lot of the companies have very vested interests, like carbon capture. The oil and gas companies say, look, we want to preserve our production of our oil. We've got 20 years or 30 years of supply. The best way we can do that is carbon capture. So we're going to lobby the government to put money into carbon capture. There are other technologies that say, wait a minute, we want to reduce the production of hydrocarbons in the first place. We want to reduce the use of hydrocarbons, and that's where we would put the money into not carbon capture, but put the money into new technologies that replace the production of hydrocarbons. That's just one of the areas of competition. And I agree with you, the government incentives that is going to be enforced by the public and by elected officials are going to be a major aspect of which direction we go in the future. And I'd like to know if you all agree along those lines, because I think that we're going to start looking at these vested interests of these companies and maybe think that perhaps that's not the best way to go in our environmental policies, that we need to look at other directions and not basically incentivize companies that continue to do activities with technology investments when we could do things in other technology investments. So that's just a comment, and I'd like to get your ideas on that.
That's a great point. I think the problem regarding capital is that usually we anticipate. Capital is allocated usually in an anticipated manner. So if we think the future is not going to be there, let's move on to the other one. And it seems to me that to land this plane in 250, we must have capital being employed in a very organized manner. What do I mean by that? I gave you two examples. We had the pandemics, and in 2 years' time, we are back to 100 million barrels of oil a day. That's it. And if you don't deal with that, you're going to see the barrel of oil 100 or 200 or whatever, and this means inflation, this means problems for the whole world. So it seems to me that the tax incentives and other kind of incentives has also to be connected, related with what we want. And then we should have the capital and the incentives proper allocated to these areas in order to rotate this capital from oil to renewables, but in an organized manner. Otherwise, we're going to have spikes, big spikes, and big inflation, which will be another problem to deal with. So it seems to me that targets are very important, and incentives related to these targets are the best. In fact, this is one of the good things we had in Brazil during the 70s. We had the big oil spike in the 70s, and Brazil didn't have oil by that time. So we started a program called Pro Alcohol for ethanol. So if you go to Brazil today, to a service station, you can choose. They have these flex fuels, stuff that you can choose at the pump. If you want 100% ethanol or 100% gasoline or a mix of two. It's a kind of an arbitrage every time you go to the pump. And this has worked great. And the incentives were taken off. In the beginning was big subsidies. And then you would remove the subsidies and market take care of them. So it seems to me that we should do kind of the same on our transformation mode to land in 2050.
I would like to add that is that the fact that as the economies develop, we need all sources of energy. So from that perspective, developing the new technologies is critical, as well as preserving the oil and gas that have kept us going through today. If we think about developing countries where they are still not having 100% energy available for the population, so what are you going to tell them? You cannot use fossil fuels if that's what they have. You really cannot do that. So I would say that it is a portfolio of fuels what you really need depending on the conditions of each country.
Thank you very much. Any more questions? Yes, please, in the back.
Working in energy sector. So we hear a lot about the transition and mostly about solar and wind seems to be the bigger. We hardly hear anything about nuclear power.
Nuclear power.
No consumption. So I want to maybe, if you can comment on this, and if you guys think nuclear is can be a factor on the energy use in the next 30 to 100 years.
So the question was, we've talked a lot about solar, other things. How about nuclear? What's the reaction of the panel to that?
Again, it depends. As we know, for example, the situation in Europe, particularly in Germany, when they decided, Merkel decided that all the nuclear power plants were shut down, and they are relying on solar. For Germany, that has been really a major mistake, because they now they rely on natural gas, and the price of natural gas in Europe has gone through the roof. So again, I think what I said earlier, that you have to have a portfolio of fuel sources, and if nuclear is an option for your country, you should support it.
Good, thank you. Any more questions from the audience? We have time for probably one more question. If not, then I'd just go ahead and thank the panel for the... And on behalf of Mayor Brown, I'd like to thank the World Affairs Council of Houston for giving us this opportunity to work with you on this event. Would you like to say any final words before we part? Thank you to all of you for attending.
Well, thank you all. Thank you again to the panelists and all of you who have joined us. How many of you have been to a council event previously? Great, good to hear. I'm sure that we are going to bring many things together with Mayor Brown in the future. And thank you all for coming. I hope you enjoyed today's lunch. Thank you, Yvonne, who helped us tremendously get this together. Thank you, Norman, for making the conversation so exciting. Thank you all for